Hello, my name is Betule Zlekhah, and today in my PowerPoint, I'll be discussing the inequitable treatment of women within the workforce. The article I've chosen is titled Still a Mad Men World. Um, and this is a New York Times article that discusses the continuance of gender discrimination, specifically within the workforce, and it examines different scenarios that occur and personal experiences of people as they attest to their own experiences of either sexual harassment or discrimination and gender inequality within their own field of work. So the article begins by discussing certain societal initiatives that have already been taking place in order to promote gender equality within the workforce. And it specifically talks about the Advertising Week panel discussions that had recently took place when the article was published. And within that conference, they had different discussion panels to promote female achievement within the workforce. But the article juxtaposes these conferences to the people performing I Like It. And within his performance, he had Emily dress dancers. And so it kind of shows how, despite society wanting to make an appearance that it has been working towards progression for gender equality within the workforce, we're still a ways away from actually achieving it. And it kind of just touches on topics of continued inappropriate representation of females within the media. And then it also highlights the inequitable allocation of job positions, specifically women getting lower positions of power within work versus men. In regards to the textbook and course chapters, the pertinent ones are chapter 3, titled Images of Women, and then chapter 10 titled Work and Achievement. Chapter 3 kind of just discusses the various ways in which women are represented. And then chapter 10 really delves into a woman's experiences within the workforce. So first, we're going to examine chapter 3, Images of Women. First, I had previously mentioned the pitbull dancers that were in the conference had revealing attire on, and they were dancing while Pitbull had sung the phrase, "I ain't playing with you, but I want to play with you." Um, in addition to this, the article discusses how there are still commercials promoting stereotypical images of women that have not gone away. And then the article also discusses how there have been efforts to rectify such inappropriate representation of women within the media. So we have been making efforts to change the narrative and to change the way in which women are depicted, specifically in the media, TV shows, advertisements. Despite this progress, this faces a lot of opposition due to it being such a male-concentrated field. So that's kind of what the article talks about as well. A quote from the article is, "Creative teams are still led overwhelmingly by men." So even with efforts for this progress, for gender equality, and changing the narrative of how women are represented in media, because creative teams are so overwhelmingly led by men, there's kind of a limitation to that. And then this gives way to sexist behavior within the workplace. One of the people within the article narrated her own experiences. She says that at her work, she's called nicknames like quote unquote the face or the body, and she hears those nicknames thrown around to other girls. Such nicknames show how heavily centered a woman's perception is based off of her body imagery. There was also another creative director at an international agency, Kate Katalinek, and she talks about her own experiences with inappropriate sexual related encounters in the workforce. She states that she's previously been threatened with rape and has even been offered sex for new luggage. She also describes how she's been asked to arrange coffee meetings as they presume that she doesn't hold a position of leadership. One of the topics within the chapter is the fact that there is a hypersexualization and objectification of women, specifically within video games. And this is super important because it's shaping how children are starting to perceive women. That leads to shaping their behavior of how they treat women within the workforce as well. So if they're seeing them in a hypersexualized way in video games, then they're going to treat them that way and expect such things in real life. Then there's also the sexual objectification of women within the media, which we've already kind of touched on, including TV shows, advertisements, and movies. And this goes back to the way in which, it's deemed okay, and it's sort of promoting this sexual objectification of women within the workforce. And it explains some of the behaviors that the article discusses with various women within their own work. And then the textbook also discusses the topic of faceism. And this is basically how much of the face is depicted within an image of a person. So there's this trend and commonality of showing more of women's bodies when depicting them in an image versus a man where more of his face is shown. And this again centers her perception, a female's perception based off of her body, and leads to this sexual objectification and overall hypersexualization of women that contributes to the derogatory treatment of women within the workforce that the article discusses. Moving on to the next chapter, which is chapter 10. In the article, one of the quotes is that the business still rewards male executives who encourage or excuse inappropriate workplace behavior. That just speaks to the culture and the climate within the workforce, and how derogatory treatment of women and inappropriate treatment of women is still accepted. One of the people within the article that shares her experiences is Molly Dunn, and she talks about this cyclical harassment and discrimination that she faces. And one of her quotes were, "There's a huge allowance for bad behavior." So again, that goes back to this passive acceptance of sexual inappropriate commentary and treatment towards women within the workforce. And there's an agency that's discussed within the article, and that's the Anomaly Agency. And the article states how their leadership team is approximately 80% made of men. And then going back to that quote we saw earlier, creative teams are still led overwhelmingly by men. So definitely this inequitable allocation of leadership and of positions of power leads to a negative environment in which women aren't treated appropriately within the workforce. So, like their female predecessors from decades ago, they find themselves stuck on accounts for jewelry and beauty products. This goes to show how, even with occupational positions, there's still this setback of progress and of success in place for women because they are deemed as feminine, or there's a stereotype surrounding them. And so this was one of the accounts in the article that noted how some of the people within the workforce, they had accounts for jewelry and beauty products only. And it's this notion of that's all a woman is capable of. The article also discusses the large gender gap, the large gender pay gap within the marketing field. And it talks about how this is one of the biggest gaps, specifically in the marketing field. I also wanted to discuss Dader Smalls Landu, her experiences within the article, and she is a chief marketing officer for Media and Marketing Agency. And she talks about how she's pretty much the only Black woman in this position of power. So she really has to have this tough skin and put up with a lot of what she experiences just because she's quote unquote lucky enough to be in that position. We're going to talk about this in relation to the textbook concepts. First, going back to the vertical segregation within the workforce. So that's going back to the experiences of the limiting occupational positions that the women are able to have. Again, those beauty and jewelry accounts because of this inequitable allocation of power. And then the textbook also discusses hiring discrimination. So leadership roles are stereotyped as masculine positions. Women aren't the first thing that come to mind when somebody thinks of a leadership role, and that's influenced by media's representation of women. And, this and vertical segregation is what's contributing to that highly male group of leadership roles that the New York Times article discusses. And then women are also less likely to be promoted because they're perceived as unfit and because of possible conflicts with family life. This is something that the textbook discusses, and it talks about how people at work deem a woman, sometimes incapable, and they limit her abilities because she might have issues at work, going back to the role of being a mother. And then, of course, the article discussed the wage gap within industry, and this is something that the textbook also discusses. They stated how economists have calculated that women will earn 1.2 million less than a man within her entire work career. This is despite equal abilities, equal achievements of success. A woman is still receiving significantly lower pay than a man, which is supported in the experiences discussed within the article. And then going back to the Black woman being the only Black woman within her position of power, the chief executive, experience is really parallel with this idea of a token woman that chapter 10 talks about. The textbook material discusses how this token woman, it's essentially like female being or a minority being in a position of power, and that person is put under a lot of pressure to be perfect, to show and excel her abilities because she's given this opportunity. That goes back to the article, the woman within the article that talked about needing a tough skin. If she showed that she's weak, then she might be deemed as less. So this idea of a token woman really was depicted within her experiences. So some initiatives for progress. First and foremost, there needs to be regulations in place that prohibit gender-based discrimination and harassment within the workforce. And it's not enough just to put these regulations. I believe there needs to be initiatives to actually enforce them, because there are already regulations in place, but it's actually enforcing these regulations and not letting them pass through is what's actually necessary to promoting a more hospitable environment within the workforce for women. And then it's extremely necessary to work towards dismantling stereotypes regarding females in leadership positions in order to create more equitable allocation of power. I believe this starts at the root with children. The depiction of women needs to begin at youth, and it needs to be appropriate within cartoons, within video games especially. And that most definitely shapes how a child perceives a woman. Dismantling these stereotypes is super important in order to allow for women to break through that obstacle of vertical segregation within their occupation. And then there needs to be more initiatives for equal gender pay in order to close the wage gap. This has become, a back burner issue that's been overlooked. We're all aware of it. We're all aware that women are not paid equally as men. And I believe there's this sort of complacency now about it, but I don't think that's right or reasonable when a woman is working just as equally hard as a man, if not harder, considering the second shift that she has to go work at home as a mother. There needs to be better pay for her. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening in, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.